everyone, welcome back to the Empty Pantry. I'm Amy and I'm here to help you turn your tight budget into delicious meals. So, yesterday I had this giant list of things that I wanted to do. Okay, I didn't want to do them, I needed to do them, but it was cold and rainy outside. So, I decided not to do that giant list of things to do and I decided to bake. I did have some bananas and some apples that were definitely past their prime, and so I decided I should whip those up into something delicious. So in this video, I'm going to show you the 3 things that I made to completely avoid my to-do list.
Today we made some apple strudel muffins. We also made my favorite banana bread. And then finally, I made some apple breakfast tarts. Okay, let's make this apple strudel muffins. We're going to start with the strudel topping. So we're going to take a little bowl, and to that, we're going to add half a cup of just white all purpose flour, half a cup of regular oatmeal. Don't use steel cut or the quick one, use the regular oatmeal. And then a quarter cup of brown sugar and a half a teaspoon of some cinnamon. And then just a little bit of salt. We're going to add a quarter teaspoon of some regular table salt. And we're going to mix this together and just kind of get it incorporated before we add our butter. So once it's incorporated, we're going to cut in 1/4 cup of butter that I cut into little cubes because it is cold. Do not melt it. You want it nice and cold when you do this. We're going to look to get that butter really cut up into the mixture. I'm using a pastry cutter. You can use a fork as well to do this process. You just want to get the butter nice and cut up in there so it looks kind of gritty, kind of like this. And then once it's to this point, we're going to just set this aside while we move on to our batter. Okay, moving over to a new bowl, we're going to mix our dry ingredients. We're going to mix 1.5 cups all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and then half a teaspoon of baking soda, followed by a quarter teaspoon of regular salt, and then 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. You could add more if you really like cinnamon, but 1 teaspoon seems to be sufficient. And then also we need to add 3/4 a cup of regular white sugar. Now that that's incorporated, I'm going to add my chopped up apples, peeled and sliced, just little chunks. Think about muffin size. You don't want huge pieces of apple in there. I'm just going to stir those around in my dry ingredients to get them all really nice and coated before moving on to my wet ingredients. In a separate bowl, I have half a cup of regular milk. I think this was 2% milk. You could use whatever kind that you like. Even an almond milk would also be good. And then I'm going to add to that 1 egg. And then we need to add a little bit of vegetable oil or applesauce. Either one of them will work, but it's going to be half a cup of whichever one you chose. I'm using vegetable oil today because I didn't have applesauce. And then I'm just going to mix those all together before pouring them into my dry ingredients. Now, if you don't want to do this separate, you don't have to, but I would suggest at least beating the egg separately instead of having it in the bowl. Now I'm just going to stir this together to get it all really well incorporated. This is going to be kind of thick, but not dry. So you want to make sure that all of the dry ingredients are well incorporated, but you can see it's kind of, I don't know, pasty. It's kind of a thick batter, but that's okay. It creates a really nice, dense, juicy, moist, not juicy, moist is a better word, muffin. So once that's all nice and incorporated, you can see the apples are all nicely distributed in there. We're going to get them in our little muffin tins. You could do this as a bread if you wanted to as well, but I'm going to do mine in some muffin tins. And using an ice cream scoop, I get pretty clean batter into the muffin tin without, making a mess everywhere. It also makes them nice and even. And it's always nice when they all turn out even and you use up all of your batter. I just love that. It makes me happy. And before we put them in the oven, we do need to put that strudel topping on them. I know it might be kind of weird, but it does need to cook. It does have some butter in it and some flour, and you shouldn't eat raw flour. So we're going to put that on top of these muffins. It's about 1 tablespoon per muffin, but use up all of your topping. So just distribute it across the top. It's going to be nice and dry on top of all of them right before we put them in the oven. And these muffins are going to bake at 350 for 27 to 30 minutes. You're just looking for a clean toothpick to come out. And then when they're done, they're nice golden brown. And just let them sit for a little bit before eating them. Those apples tend to get really hot in the oven, but enjoy. These are so good. Now let's make some banana bread. This is one of my favorite banana bread recipes. So 1 1/4 cup sugar is the first thing we're going to put in the mixer. You can also do this in a bowl if you like. The mixer is just easier. You don't have to be so much hands-on. So that is 1 1/4 cups of sugar. And then we need to get some butter in here. It's going to call for 1 stick of butter. You can melt it. If it's just soft, that is also just fine. But we're going to put that in with the sugar. We're going to get that creamed up together with 2 whole eggs. If you're one to crack the egg and get some shell in there, make sure that you do it in a little bowl separately before putting it into your mixer because you don't want any shells in the bread. That would be kind of gross. So we're going to add those in and then we're just going to beat this up until it's really light and fully creamed together. So it'll look like this. It's nice and creamy looking. And now we're going to add our bananas. I throw my bananas right in there when I'm using a stand mixer because it mashes them up just fine. If you're using a bowl, you're going to put your soft bananas in a bowl and use a fork to kind of mash them up. And I usually add between 3 and 5 bananas. It just really depends on how many I have that are ripe and also how big those bananas are. And then we're also going to add 1/2 cup of milk. Buttermilk is a really good option for this recipe. So if you have buttermilk, use that. I'm just going to let it keep mixing. And then we need to add a little bit of vanilla. So 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And then we need to start adding our dry ingredients. So I'm going to do 1 teaspoon of baking soda and then 1 teaspoon of salt. Of course, we're going to need some flour. So 2 1/2 cups of all-purpose flour. I have also used half wheat and half white flour, and that is also very good if you're looking for a little bit more nutrition. And we're just going to mix this until all the flour is incorporated. You don't need to continue to mix this. Just get it all nice and wet. And if you get a little bit of flour in your beater, you can scrape that down and mix it in there. And then we're going to have our 2 loaf pans that I have sprayed with some baking spray, which just is the spray with some flour in it. If you don't have that, you can just use some vegetable shortening or regular Pam is fine just as well. And I'm going to pour that into my 2 baking pans and get it as evenly as you possibly can. I find if I put the pans next to each other, then I can kind of eyeball to make sure that they're even. And you want to do that so that the baking time is similar on both of them and you don't overbake or underbake one of them. So just divide it and then we're ready to go into the oven. We're going to bake these at 350 for about 55 to 60 minutes. You're just looking for it to be completely done. You can test it with a toothpick to make sure that there's nothing raw in the middle. So depending on your oven, it's going to be about an hour-ish. You're just looking for a nice golden brown on the top and that the dough is not wet on the inside. This is what it looks like when it's all done. And then just let it sit for a little bit and then slice it up with some nice soft butter and enjoy. Let's make the apple breakfast tarts now. I'm going to start by preparing my apples. You're going to want 4 to 6 medium apples and they have been peeled and sliced fairly thin. I'm going to add 1/2 cup of brown sugar, 1/4 cup of regular white sugar, 1/2 teaspoon of some ground cinnamon, and then just a little bit of nutmeg. I added about 1/8 teaspoon of nutmeg. I'm going to stir this around my apples and get them all really nice and coated. And then I'll set this aside while I start making my dough. This will give them a chance to marinate a little bit. And then they're done when the dough's done. And I don't have to worry about going back and doing my apples then. So you can do it either way you want. But we're going to get all mixed up and then we'll set that aside while we get onto our dough. Pulling out another large bowl, I'm going to add 2 1/2 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, and then I want that salt to be distributed throughout my flour, so I'm just going to give it a little mix. You can use whatever you have. I had that pastry cutter handy, so I just went ahead and used that. I just didn't want a big glob of salt before I added my vegetable shortening. This is going to be 1 cup of vegetable shortening. You just want to make sure that it's either room temperature or cold. You don't want to melt it. That is not something you want. And I'm just going to use my pastry cutter to cut that shortening into the flour. What I'm looking for is that the little pieces of shortening are no bigger than the size of a pea. Now that it's all cut in there really nicely, we're going to start adding our wet ingredients. So the first thing that we're going to add is some eggs. So I have one egg yolk. I have the yolk and the white divided. And then I'm going to add that one yolk into half a cup of milk. You could put this right in the bowl, but I'm just adding them on the side. So the egg yolk in the half cup of milk, mix that around just a little bit, and then pour it into my dry ingredients. Now that it's in there, we're just going to mix it up. It is going to be kind of a dry type of dough, so you may need to use your hands to get it all incorporated, but that's what we're looking for, so that there's no flour left. And we're going to make a nice ball so we can roll it out on the counter so that we can cut it up into our tarts. So I did divide my dough in half. So I was only working with half of it at a time. So it's a little bit more manageable, and that's perfectly fine. This is going to make about 6 of the breakfast tarts. So keep that in mind, that out of this sheet, we're going to do 3, and out of the other ball of dough, we will make another 3. So get it as square as possible because you are going to be cutting it into rectangles, and get it as thin as you can, but not too thin because you want it to be able to hold together. If someone has it in their hand and they're not using a fork, you don't want it falling apart on them. And once you get it rolled nice and as thin as you can, we need to straighten out the edges. And so use some type of straight edge to cut it nice and straight. We're going to make a big rectangle out of this, and as straight as you possibly can. Sometimes putting the seams together to make it a little bit bigger is a good idea. And these will bake together, so don't stress about it too much if you have to push those pieces together. But do save the scraps because we're going to need those. So I'm just getting it nice and straight, and then I'm going to cut this into 6 rectangles and get them as close to the same size as you possibly can because they're going to go on top of each other. Okay, now we need to get them filled. So a little spoonful of apples in the center of 3 of these pieces of pastry. And then the bottom row is going to be for the topping. So a little bit of apples, and you kind of just have to test the number of apples or how big a spoonful. Sometimes you have to remove a couple apples once you put the top on there. So this is a little bit of trial and error. I did put too much this first time. I was trying to be super generous with my apples, but it didn't work out super great, and I did have to remove some of these. So once those apples are in the center, we need to take the bottom layer and get it over the top. So stretch it out just a little bit, and then we're just going to seal all the way around the edges the best you can with your fingers. And then if your fingers aren't doing that great of job, a fork works really good. So you can grab a little fork and start kind of pressing down to get those corners sealed. You just want to make sure the apples are sealed in there because the juice will just run out and make a mess in the oven. So do your best to get those nice and sealed up. And then before transferring them to the baking sheet, we do want to add a couple little slices on top to let some of the hot air out when they're baking. I guess you could do it when it's on the baking sheet, but anyways, just make sure you get those slices in there, and then just keep doing this until you have used all your dough up. You may have a little bit of apples left over. I did. It really depends on how many of the tarts that you make and how many apples that you cut up. So use up all of your dough, and then you might have some extra apples to do something else with. They would be good made into applesauce if you just throw them on the stove to cook down, or with just a spoon and just eat them. That would be also very, very good. So now I have all of these made, and they're on my baking sheet. And to add just like a nice sheen across the top, I'm going to use that egg white from the egg that I had earlier. And I'm going to use the pastry brush and just brush it all over the top of each of these. Now, you can see these are homemade. They are not perfectly shaped. Some of them are kind of ugly, but I promise you, they are really, really delicious, and your family will eat them even if they're not absolutely beautiful. Out of the 6 I made, only one of them looked really pretty. So there you go. And I bake all the time, and that's what you get. So once those are coated in the egg wash, we're going to put them in the oven, and we're going to bake these at 375 for about 25 minutes. You're looking for them to be a nice golden brown, and then once they have cooled off, you can just break them open and eat them. These are so, so good. I mean, technically, it's like apple pie, but we called it a breakfast tart. So we're going to eat these for breakfast, but they could be a dessert. They're so, so good. And if you have any left over, just make sure you keep them in a sealed container. But I promise you, these will not last long. They are so delicious.
Well, what do you think? Would you call that a productive day? It wasn't exactly my to do list, but I did save some apples and bananas from the trash can, and I was able to make a whole bunch of really yummy treats for the family. If you've ever tried these recipes, I'm sure you've tried at least one of them before. I'd love to hear if you have any special ingredients or certain methods that you use for them. Please put them in the comments below. And as always, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I have lots more recipes to share with you. So until next time, anytime you need to avoid your to-do list, remember baking is a very productive use of your time. Bye.